I think the documentary set the tone for the remainder of our symposium. I felt it to be, as you probably have seen, I've seen several of these types of documentaries. They're very emotive and kind of brings to life the kind of theoretical conversation we've been having about how this actually impacts the daily life of people today. And I really appreciated Tanoja's comment in the morning, which is philosophy for the sake of philosophy is fine, but the point is to actually change the world, to quote Marx. And this gives us a glimpse as to why we're doing this. So with that, we're going to open up our second panel discussion. This is on Medicare in a comparative context, and we're absolutely thrilled, delighted, and extremely honored to have Professor William Darity from Duke University in the Department of Economics. He is arguably one of the leading, if not the leading, scholar that's looking at the relationship between economic development and inequality, particularly with the African American community. And so this is something that came up earlier, I believe, and actually in Dr. Thorat's talk, when you concluded your piece, that there's a very moving dialogue that took place between W.E.B. Du Bois and Ambedkar during the formation of the UN. And so it's something we feel at the center, and also with our students here, that one of the first linkages, and this came up in a question at the end of the last session, one of the first linkages we can begin to think about is the experience, at least the relationship between race and caste. And what that means is the experience, the African American experience in this country, 500 years old, the singularity of that experience and its long and complex history with the long and complex history of caste inequality and oppression in India. So there's a linkage there that's very exciting, and we look forward to learning more about that. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Professor Darity, and then we'll move to our next two speakers. So please welcome Professor Darity.
I'd like to say a special thanks to Larry Simon for organizing this important event and for inviting me to participate. I'm very, very thrilled and excited to learn more about a research center in the United States that's focused on questions of social exclusion. I'd also like to thank Dr. Thorat for his friendship, his scholarship, and his spirit of collaboration. We've got a lot more work to do, so I'll try to stay alive. Also, I'd like to recognize Vimal Thorat, an English literature scholar who is an expert on Dalit poetry, and I need to negotiate with her about the status of an excellent paper she presented at a conference we held last spring on the comparative status of Dalits and tribals in India and blacks in the United States. I'd like to get that paper in a publication we'd like to put out, so I'll have to negotiate with her for that. And finally, I also want to say thanks to Pankaj Meshram for his immediate friendship and generosity. So thank you. So I have to offer a disclaimer before I plunge in. I've done a great deal of thinking about the comparative position of blacks in the United States and the scheduled castes and tribes in India. And the parallels are so stunning that I often refer to black folks in the United States as America's untouchables. But Larry Simon posed a different project for me to undertake, one that kind of pushes me outside of my comfort zone. He asked me to do a comparative analysis of the civil rights movement in the United States with the anti-caste movement in India. And this is something I had not really thought about with any care. And I'm not an expert on social movements, so feel free to have at me in the question and answer period. I will say at the outset, I much prefer the language of anti-caste to civil rights. Okay? The resonance of the term civil rights with civility has always troubled me. Why should anyone be civil in resisting uncivil conditions? Civil rights carries with it the trope of respectability, what I think Dr. Ambedkar referred to as the behavior of the self-respecting sect of untouchables. In the United States, it's the behavior of what we may refer to as the black middle class, or what E. Franklin Frazier described as the black bourgeoisie. These are the straddlers, with a complicated position, placing them to some degree on the leading edge of a struggle, but also as functioning quislings. So there's some alternatives to the term civil rights that I've thought of, might be helpful. How about the anti-white supremacy movement or the anti-racism movement? Maybe a little more safe, public rights or even human rights. And then there's Stokely Carmichael's phrase, the Black Power movement, which has a comparable companion in the Indian context of the Dalit Power movement. Now it's interesting that there's a particular role that religion seems to play in both movements, but somewhat antithetical roles. So in the United States, there's a long history of black ministers serving as the leader figures in the black community. If you go back to the point at which General Sherman is in Savannah after his march through Georgia, and he is meeting with a set of black leaders as a prelude to his issuing his special order that is the first major document that provides a basis for 40 acres and a mule for the ex-slaves. His conversation, the leaders who are engaged in his conversation are black ministers. And that kind of pattern carries on to today. So the ministry is typically conducted on the terms of Christianity, and there's a somewhat mixed set of messages in Christianity. So in the New Testament, we are told to turn the other cheek, right, which is consistent with civility. But in the Old Testament, we have a God of vengeance and retribution, and there is a prophetic tradition that's associated with that, which says you take up arms when necessary. For example, the black revolutionary Nat Turner was very much in that prophetic tradition of the Old Testament. There are passages in the Bible that suggest that individuals should accept their lot in life, whether they are slave or free. So there's a certain passivity that's encouraged, and then of course you'll get your benefit in the hereafter. And that's somewhat similar to the spirit of the argument that's made about the nature of reincarnation in Hinduism. If you're born into a station, you accept it, you behave appropriately within it, and then maybe in the next life you'll have a better station. Okay? But there's also liberation theology that emerges from the Bible as well. And this is particularly the reason why during the period of slavery, I think blacks were drawn so particularly to the story of Moses and the escape from Egypt. In addition, there was actually, as the civil rights movement evolved in the post-1940s period, there was actually a division among black ministers in the United States. The majority did not actually support the movement, and in particular, the majority were opposed to Martin Luther King's activities. But fundamentally, the black church served as a support for the civil rights movement, even though the congregations that acted in support of the movement were a clear minority of the congregations in the United States. To a large degree, the civil rights movement, in terms of its most active protest activities, the front line the front line of the struggle was waged by black college students in the United States. So we don't necessarily think of religion as an obstacle to black rights in the United States. I can make a case that it might be, but I'm not going to go there right now. But clearly in the context of the anti-caste movement in India, religion is a central obstacle to be addressed. Hindu theology is treated as the foundation for casteism, and so the annihilation of caste, in Dr. Ambedkar's view, would have required the annihilation of Hinduism. I think that there's some ambiguity about the sequence in which these sorts of things have to happen. Do you eliminate the ideology first and the associated behaviors and rituals, or do you eliminate the structure first and then the ideology might wither away. And that's kind of the conversation that we were having earlier. And I think Ambedkar's position is somewhat ambiguous on this. There's a place where he says, the real method of breaking up the caste system was not to bring about intercaste dinners and intercaste marriages, but to destroy the religious notions on which caste was founded. So in this case, it sounds as though he's suggesting that you have to destroy the entire religious foundation for casteism to get fraternity. But there are other places where it seems like he's saying greater fraternity will promote the erosion or destruction of the caste system. So, but at the heart of it is, in the Indian context, I think one has to make the argument that a structure of religious beliefs stands as the obstacle to the removal of the caste system. And this is somewhat different from the mobilization of religious institutions in the United States to try to support the civil rights movement. In the Indian context, the anti-colonial movement temporarily overlaps with the anti-caste movement. And there are mutually reinforcing and contradictory dimensions of this relationship. So it's apparent that the Congress Party needed to accommodate the large segment of newly enfranchised members of the Indian electorate, the Dalits and tribals, and so there were political reasons in addition to Dr. Ambedkar's intellectual superiority. I mean, yeah, when people talk about the smartest person in the room, I mean, he was almost always the smartest person in the room. So there were some intellectual and credentialed reasons why he was asked to write the Indian Constitution for the post-independence period, but I think there were some political reasons as well, which was the Congress Party's desire to maintain political support from the Dalit community especially. And so he was in a position to inscribe directly into law anti-caste discrimination provisions and the reservation system. Okay? There's no black American leader, in quotes, who has ever had the capacity to do what Dr. Ambedkar accomplished in India. And so it's that side of it that the anti-colonial movement reinforces some aspects of the anti-caste movement, but on the other hand, the contradictory dimensions arise in the following way. It's not clear, it was not necessarily clear that conditions would improve for the Dalit community after independence, when they would be face to face with the upper caste without the mediating presence of the colonial rulers and without communal roles in the electoral process. And the communal roles were blocked by Gandhi, of course, by going on one of his infinite fasts. So in the United States, in contrast, there's not an overlap with the anti-colonial movement and the civil rights movement. There is, however, an overlap with the anti-communist movement temporarily with the civil rights movement. And again, there's a mutually reinforcing and a contradictory dimension of that aspect of it. So the United States, as officialdom, perceiving themselves as being in competition with the Soviet Union, began to perceive that there were some benefits from removing the conditions that led to what Myrdal called the American dilemma. And so Hubert Humphrey kind of epitomized this kind of merger of Cold War sentiment with civil rights support. And so Mary Dudziak has a fine book called Cold War Civil Rights, and I would say that Humphrey was a paradigmatic warrior for the Cold War and for civil rights simultaneously. On the other hand, the Red Scare made it easier to paint activists as leftist subversives, communist agitators, and the like. And of course, this was a normal kind of pattern in the rhetoric that was used by a number of Southern senators, especially Senator John Stennis from Mississippi. So, yeah. Okay. So both sides are against communism, but one side uses it to support a case for improving the conditions for blacks in the United States, and the others use it to support maintenance of the status quo. I'll also want to add that if we think about the tactics of each movement, there is some similarity. So Martin Luther King, of course, was explicitly influenced by Gandhi's approach, which is characterized as passive resistance in the United States. Some people would say it's passive active resistance, but okay, passive resistance. Okay, and the Ambedkar's leadership of the anti-caste movement was characterized by an emphasis on nonviolent agitation. Now, it's less clear to me who influenced whom in terms of these tactical strategies, because the anti-caste movement actually, I think, has a longer history than the anti-colonial movement. But anyway, in both cases, alternatives emerged to these strategies that emphasize nonviolence. In fact, alternatives existed in the United States prior to the period where Martin Luther King becomes the visible leader of the movement. There actually was a history, particularly in the South, of several communities that took up arms for the purposes that I'll come to in a moment. And then subsequent to the height of the civil rights movement, we have the introduction of more militant approaches to trying to gain black rights, the Black Panther movement, the rhetoric of Malcolm X, and I think in the Indian context you have the emergence of the Dalit Panthers, who are modeled in some ways after the Black Panthers. But the issue of taking up arms raises two questions, which are related, but they are not the same. The first is whether or not you take up arms at all. But the second is, what is your purpose for taking up arms? Is it for self-defense, or is it for liberation? It's an important distinction. So the Black Panthers and the Dalit Panthers, I would argue, philosophically have been committed to the use of arms for self-defense purposes. But I don't believe that in either the United States or in India has there ever been a significant movement that has coalesced around the notion that we take arms to force our oppressors to change their ways, as opposed to pursuing strategies where we try to persuade our oppressors to change their ways. And indeed, that's a somewhat reasonable position given the nature of the forces of repression that would be directed in greatest degree against those who would take up arms. The forces of repression are fairly vicious against those who don't take up arms. So you think about Martin Luther King's assassination, where in some sense he was the safest of the spokesmen in the black community. But also Malcolm X and Fred Hampton were executed in approximately the same period of time. And then, of course, there are day-to-day atrocities. Police lynchings of blacks are now pervasive in the United States, and they stand in for a longer history of vigilante lynchings. The universe of atrocities is vast. That's also conducted against Dalits and tribals in India. It may be more dangerous to appeal to the police for help when some criminal act has been taken against an individual as Dalit. And the Dalit Panthers have been especially important in supporting and protecting those who attempt to bring charges against their perpetrators. So I'll close with this, and then there's a lot of stuff that we can talk about in the question and answer, I suspect. But one of the key distinctions between one of the outcomes of this process is the nature of affirmative action in India and in the United States. And so in the US context, we think about affirmative action as being preferential boost. And in the Indian context, we think of affirmative action as being reservations or quotas. But in the Indian context, there has been no history of application or systematic application of affirmative action in the private sector. As Professor Torat pointed out yesterday, it's entirely voluntary and self-regulating on the part of private enterprises in India. But in the United States, we've never had parliamentary reservations. And in fact, when Lani Guinier was being considered for leadership of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, I'm not sure the exact.
Was it in the Justice Department?
It was in the it was a position in the Justice Department. She had written several professional papers in law journals about different types of voting arrangements, some of which resemble what we would call the parliamentary reservation system in India. And she was roundly denounced. I think she was labeled a quota queen, and President Clinton at the time withdrew her nomination as a consequence of the response. So the United States has never had anything that looks like parliamentary reservations in an explicit way. But one could argue that under the period of Jim Crow, where blacks were excluded from voting, we really did have a system of parliamentary reservations for whites. Okay. And then the final thing I want to say is neither movement historically has attacked the problem of wealth inequality. Although there are some strands of the Dalit movement that are concerned about a focus on land and water resources, but there has never been a movement that has centered directly on attacking the scope of inequality that's based on group difference and group identity. And so I do have some data on wealth inequality in India, but it's the most recent data that I have is from a study that used survey information from 2002. So I'll hold on that. I think that that's a project that needs to be undertaken, is a re-examination of the wealth position of the various social groups in India. But in the United States, I'm going to conclude with this, the data is stunning. I mean, you know, people may say that, you know, if you close the wealth gap, you'll still have other kinds of problems. And I say that may be true, but let's run the experiment. Okay, so in the United States in 2011, the median black family had $7,113 in net worth. The median white family had $111,740 in net worth. So black net worth was essentially about 1/20th of white net worth at the median. And in the city of Boston, the median white family had a net worth of $247,500. The median black family, well, what do you think the median black family had in Boston in terms of net worth?
0?
That's close, $8. Okay. So it's a laughable $8, okay? So these wealth differentials are staggering, and given the significance of wealth in terms of providing families with economic security, capacity to participate in the political system and the like, this is amazing. The other most striking statistic is whites in the United States with no high school education have $10,000 more in net worth than blacks who have completed college. We'll stop.